Hola a todas y todos, gracias por acompañarnos en este workshop en vivo de Nerdearla 2022. Esperemos que estén disfrutando y aprovechando las charlas y talleres que se están realizando. En esta oportunidad nos acompaña Anais, que presentará su workshop Security Scanning for Everyone. Anais es developer en Aqua Security, donde contribuye a los proyectos open source nativos en la nube de Aqua. Cuando no está promoviendo las mejores prácticas para DevOps, dirige su propio canal de YouTube centrado en las tecnologías nativas de la nube. Antes de unirse a Aqua, Anais trabajó como CR en Cibo, un proveedor de servicios en la nube, donde ayudó a mejorar la infraestructura de cientos de grupos de clusters. Como embajadora de CNCF del año 2021, su pasión radica en hacer que las herramientas y plataformas sean más accesibles para los desarrolladores y miembros de la comunidad. Les recuerdo que pueden realizar sus preguntas, comentarios o consultas durante el chat. De la presentación les vamos a ir acercando a Anais las preguntas. Thank you so much, Anais, for being part of Nerdiala 2022. The space is all yours.
Hi, thank you for having me. This was the first time I heard my bio in Spanish, which was amazing. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for attending this workshop, Security Scanning for Everyone. So this is really an interactive workshop. It's supposed to be interactive. It's based on a SecurityCon, KubeCon presentation I gave with a coworker of mine at the last KubeCon. I'm just going to share my screen. I know you see hopefully my slides. So whenever you have any questions, please do post them in the chat. I think that was just mentioned, but I'm just going to repeat it again. So my name is Anais. A bit more about myself and why I'm giving this workshop to you. Because, I mean, you want to know why somebody is presenting what they're presenting, right? So I work as open source developer advocate at Aqua Security. All of the tools, or like the tool that this workshop is based on, is completely open source. Everything I'm showing to you is completely open source. You don't have to sign up. You don't send us any data. There's nothing, no information that we're saving about you or anything. It's really open source. Just to mention that. Now, before I started working in Aqua Security as developer advocate, I was working last year as site reliability engineer at a cloud native small startup in the UK, where we were basically taking care of the Kubernetes clusters, the infrastructure at that startup. And before that, I was working as well as developer advocate for several years, but only since the end of 2020 in the cloud native space. I also have a YouTube channel where I share end-to-end tutorials from across the space about cloud native tools and projects. So you can check that out if you're curious about some of the other tutorials and just content that I put out there. Most of the tutorials also have a written version in English though on it. And you can find it on my blog as well as my weekly DevOps newsletter if that's something you're interested in. I just share on a weekly basis any interesting content from other people, from companies, from conferences such as this one that I came across. If you have any interesting content that you would like to share with me and have highlighted in this newsletter, you can also reach out. Now, this is about me. Let's get started with the workshop in 1 second. I have a 4-month-old puppy, and I'm saying that because she's in the room with me. She's sleeping right now, so you might hear her snore in the background, or maybe she's going to start chewing or digging on something or similar. So if she makes noises in the background, just ignore her. I'm really sorry about that, but I hope this cute picture makes up for it. So let's get started with security scanning. First of all, what is security scanning, right? Security scanning is a very, very broad term that encompasses lots of different things. Now, generally, security scanning is implemented across your development lifecycle. So when you get started to develop an application, over developing the application, to testing the application, to deploying it, then observing that running deployment, and then ultimately aiming to improve your application, across all those different steps, you can implement security scanning. So security scanning is basically the process where you have a tool, a scanner, and you point it at a target. Now, the target might be a file system. The target might be an application. The target might be a library, some software packages. It could be a container image, but the target could also be infrastructure as code, whether that's Terraform configuration, whether that's a Docker file, whether that's I don't know, CloudFormation, anything, a Kubernetes manifests, anything that's infrastructure as code can also be a target. So those are different things that you can scan. And then also you can do runtime security scanning, where you basically scan your running workloads. So while you have static scanning, when you scan your static resources, whether that's your application, your code, your infrastructure before you deploy it, but you also have dynamic scanning, where you scan your running workloads as they might change in your environments, in your infrastructure. So that's basically security scanning. And security scanning can do lots of different things. And again, it's a really, really broad term, but these are some of the things that you might want to scan when you develop and deploy your application, your services. Generally, when we talk about security scanning, we can differentiate a lot between culture and tools. So the culture that's needed to implement security scanning. We talk a lot about changes and like shifting left and DevSecOps and processes that might need to change when you implement security scanning. But we also talk a lot about the different tools that are available in the space. Now, in this presentation, I'm really going to focus on the tools. I'm not going to focus on the cultural aspect or the state of DevSecOps or similar. I have some other presentations where I do that, but I really want to focus in this case on the tools and how you can actually get started with security scanning. Because a lot of times when we want to get started with anything really, the most like whether that's a hobby or something in tech, a new framework, a new project, the question is really why would I get started? And then how do I get started? And why you would want to get started with security scanning? That's really about making your application, your entire infrastructure, your development lifecycle more secure. And then how you get started is identifying the right tools. So here's an overview of the different cloud native tools that security scanners that are available. I'm just curious, like I don't see the chat, but if you can post in the chat if you have worked with Kubernetes before, that would be amazing to know. Just maybe if the moderator could share that with me. So if you're active in the chat, just say like, yes, you have, or no, you haven't, or maybe like a bit in your own environments. That would be really, really useful to know. Now, for this workshop, you don't need to know how to use Kubernetes clusters. We're going to use some of it at the end, towards the end of the workshop, but you don't need to know your way around Kubernetes to follow along. And this is really an interactive workshop, so you can follow a lot along. So open source security scanners in the cloud native space. So cloud native is anything that's kind of Kubernetes related, focused on containers. So we have in the space, we have different types of scanners. Some of them focus, for example, on vulnerability scanning, scanning either your resources or containers for vulnerabilities. Now, in the cloud native space, specifically containers would be checked for vulnerabilities. Then you also have infrastructure as code misconfiguration scans, whether or not that's cloud native. That doesn't really matter too much, most of the scanners. But basically, those infrastructure as code scanners, they scan any manifests where you define your infrastructure, whether that's Terraform, CloudFormation, any YAML manifests. They can scan those if there's anything misconfigured. And then you have in-cluster scanning, which is basically related to your running workloads of in-cluster in your Kubernetes cluster scanning. You have Kubernetes pen testing. There are some projects. So as you can see, there are lots of different projects. Now, these projects here, again, they are all open source. Some of them, such as Trivy, which you're going to use in this workshop, is really like an all-in-one scanner. So it does multiple different things. Now, depending on these different factors, you will want to choose different tools. So when you get started with security scanning, you want to analyze, okay, what do you want to achieve? So you set yourself some goals, maybe within your team, you set yourself some goals, or you have some requirements that you need to meet and similar. And then depending on that, and depending on these different factors, you want to choose a different types of scanner. And so, for example, the size of your team, if you are just an individual implementing security scanning in your own side project, you can really go for any security scanner that has the functionality that you want to use. However, if you're working in a large team and you have to do multiple different types of scanning, you might want to choose a scanner such as Trivy that does all different types of scanning from across your development lifecycle, because that means that within the team you can transfer knowledge and you're not replicating steps, and you can, for example, reuse pipeline steps in your GitHub Actions or your other CI/CD pipelines. So depending on the size of your team, you want to choose a different scanner. Then depending on the industry you're working in, industries such as banking is highly regulated, where you have to meet lots of requirements. So depending on that, you will want to use different scanners, versus, for example, in a startup environment, you might just look at whatever fills your need and whatever works best for you. Then you also want to look, especially in the open source space, you want to look at which of these tools have integrations available with your existing tools and platforms. So for instance, if you're using VS Code, if you're using Vim as your preferred editor, you might want to choose an open source tool that has those integrations with those code editors available for you, which makes it easier for you to actually use the security scanner. So if I can implement a security scanner right where I develop, where I change my code, where I change my configuration files, then I'm more likely to actually scan my resources for configuration issues, for any security issues, versus if I have to use a completely separate tool. And then another thing is, if you're implementing security scanning inside of your company, you want to align the security scanning and the implementation of it with the company goals and leadership. It's really like security scanning is something that in a team has to be enforced a lot of times from the managerial level, and supported from the managerial level, because there are lots of resources and time that would go into it. A lot of these security scanners, they take some time to get started. They take some time to be implemented, such as many other tools. But the thing is, with security scanning, it's not something that's necessary for your application to run, right? Like I can have an application that is perfectly working, and has lots of critical security issues, versus and in that case, nobody will necessarily care about the security issues, versus if security scanning is something that's promoted on a managerial level, then it's kind of this invisible task being made visible, that basically people see that there's value, or enforce that there's value behind security scanning in the long term, not just when there are actually security issues that affect customers. And then the last thing is budget and expertise. Again, if you're going, these open source, too fast. These open source projects, they don't cost anything besides time, resources, and similar to spin up and run. But if you go for an enterprise tool, it can become easily quite pricey. So you want to make sure you know what you want to achieve with your security scanning. And if you want to choose an enterprise tool, there are lots of benefits. You actually have the budget and the expertise available, or you're able to access the expertise. Other ways that these security scanners differentiate, and that's really about the usage and implementation. First of all, is the installation, and we're going to see that in a second. This is just the presentation part of the workshop, just to set the scenes, and then we're going to go in the hands-on part. So installation, a lot of these tools are implemented, used as a CLI tool. So you install it in your terminal, and then you can go ahead and use the different commands. Now, other tools are implemented or run, for example, if you use tools to scan your running workloads inside of your Kubernetes cluster, then you would install, for example, Kubernetes resources, Kubernetes operators, Kubernetes jobs, and similar inside of your cluster. So the installation is one part of how do you use it. Are there as well, if you want to use the security scanner in your CI/CD pipeline, are there the steps, for example, the GitHub Actions already available to implement the security scanner into your CI/CD pipeline? Now, regarding Kubernetes resource types, if you want to scan your running workloads, for infrastructure, a lot of these scanners, they need to, if you run them externally of your infrastructure, they need to usually install something inside of your infrastructure. So you want to be aware of that. Yeah, is there a question?
Yes. Can those
Awesome.
tools be utilized for enterprise use?
Sorry, what about enterprise use?
Then in the chat you can see it.
Okay, let me open it. Can fast tools be utilized for enterprise use? Yes, there are lots of open source. So there are lots of companies. I don't know, actually. We have a site on Trivy. I can link that to you later. Oh, where are we? So we have in the Trivy project, we list all of the different companies that are using Trivy. We have lots of companies that are using Trivy in production. I can also send you some blog posts, share some blog posts afterwards on my Twitter account. You can see my Twitter account here. So check that out later. I will share some resources there. Trivy is used by lots of companies in production for their security scanning. We also have projects who went for the Aqua Enterprise tools and then actually decided that they didn't want to, that the enterprise tools were too much. They didn't quite offer what they needed, and they went back to the Trivy open source project. Now, Trivy open source is not the enterprise minus. It's just that in the enterprise platform at Aqua, Trivy is kind of packaged up in more, like there's more packaged around Trivy that you don't have, versus in the open source part, you just have bare Trivy. But there are lots of projects that use open source tools. Lots of these tools here are used in production by companies, by enterprise. The thing is, what you want to be aware of, that if you, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, if you're using an open source tool in your production environment, in large scale environments, there's a lot of more setup that you will have to do by yourself to make it work. For example, enterprise platforms, whether that's Aqua or anything else, will offer alerting on new security issues out of the box. It's part of the platform. Versus if you use Trivy, you would have to use Trivy in addition with another cloud native project, such as maybe Prometheus and Prometheus Alert Manager, to get alerts on your security issues. And that can get quite easily quite complex. So if you don't want to set things up by yourself, then and you want to implement in enterprise use cases, I would always suggest go for an enterprise platform in that case. However, if you have the resources to set things up by yourself and you're really just looking at the bare functionality of security scanning, you want to have a good security scanner, you can totally go for an open source project. I hope that answers the question. Awesome. Interrupt me, please, if there's any other question.
Okay, thank you.
Great. So the next thing is the scan coverage of the different tools. So when you do security scanning, obviously the tool has to know when something in your infrastructure or in your code base is a security issue, right? It has to get that information from somewhere. And there are lots and lots more vulnerabilities and security issues disclosed over time, or found over time. So different security scanners will pull from different databases and use the data differently. That's something you want to be kind of aware of. A lot of times we see questions of like people within the community comparing our security scanner Trivy to other open source security scanners, and they ask us, why do we see different information in the outcome? Like if we scan the same container image, why do we get different information? It's because the security scanners will use this information differently. Most of the time, there are no pro and cons. It's just like different reports that you will be provided, and maybe sometimes vulnerabilities will be shown at different stages in different ways. So that's kind of something to keep in mind. What I already mentioned, integrations, just more mature open source tools will have more community integrations, community related integrations, but also like projects that you can use with those scanners available. Also, more mature projects will have more like a larger core team or more contributors who are adding to the functionality and maintaining official integrations from that tool themselves. And that will make it a lot easier, again, for you to actually use your existing workflows for the security scanning and implement security scanning in your existing processes and into your existing platforms. And then the last thing is the focus. Some of these scanners are focused on engineers, while others are focused on security professionals. For example, the compliance scanners are usually focused on security professionals or cluster admins. They are not so much focused on engineers. So you just want to keep like those differences in mind when you're choosing a scanner. So Trivy, just Trivy overview. Trivy has lots of different functionalities. Here's some of the scan targets, things that Trivy can scan for security issues. So it can scan Git repositories, file systems, container images, Docker files, infrastructure as code, like mentioned, also specifically Kubernetes manifests. Now, I mentioned Kubernetes manifests differently because Trivy can also scan Kubernetes package managers such as Helm or customize, if you're familiar with that, which is kind of like not just the bare Kubernetes YAML, but beyond that. And then it can also generate SBOMs. It can scan your AWS account. Any resource really in your, most services in your AWS account, it can scan it for security issues. And it can also do in-cluster scanning of your running workloads inside of your Kubernetes cluster. Now, again, Trivy is highly focused on the cloud-native container Kubernetes space. There are lots of things that you can use with Trivy if you're not using containers or Kubernetes, but it is focused on the cloud-native environment mostly. So moving on to the workshop, you can totally follow along. Now, this might not be like the smoothest experience following along because I might be a bit quick. But at the end, I will provide basically also I think I can send the slides over to the organizer and you can access the slides as well. But also, also you can see like everything I'm doing in this Git repository. Sorry about that. You can also see, in addition to if I'm a bit quick, you can also just totally go to this Git repository, which is basically in cloud native security. That's just an organization. And then it's called Trivy Demo. And there you will find everything that I'm doing in this workshop as well, in addition to the slides, which I will probably add to the repository later on as well, that I forgot to do yet, but I will do that. So you can also do anything that I'm doing right now later on. Now, you might need potentially access to a Kubernetes cluster. Any Kubernetes cluster will do in that case, but this is more like afterwards, after the workshop to try out. And then you also need Docker installed and running, or something similar. And yeah, clone this repository if you want to follow along. It's probably the best way to go about it. Now, first we need to install our tool. So let me just move over. Here is Trivy. Here's the Trivy GitHub repository. You can find it at aquasecurity/Trivy. That's where you can find the Trivy repo, and you can find the documentation here as well. Now, this is just like the README is going to provide an overview of what Trivy is all about and provide some quick installation options if you quickly want to get started. But also, once you open the documentation, just make sure that you are on the latest version of Trivy, and then head over to the installation section. And here you will find lots of different installation options depending on your operating system, depending on your preferences of installing the tool and running the tool. Now, in my case, I use Homebrew usually on Mac to install it. You can really use anything that works for you. If you have any problems installing Trivy, we also have a Slack community. So if you go to slack.aquasecurity, I think aquasec.com. So slack.aquasec.com, you will find, I have it linked at the end of the slides. You head over to our Slack community and you can ask questions there, and as well as asking questions right now if you have any problems installing it. Now, once you have Trivy installed, let me just open my terminal. You can just verify that you actually have access to it by running Trivy version. And as you can see, I have version 0.32.1 installed. We have a new release of Trivy about once a month. The next one is coming out next week during KubeCon, if you're curious about our newest functionalities and features. So we have Trivy running, or we have access to Trivy. Once you have access to Trivy, you can just run Trivy, and you will see, just by running Trivy, you will see the different things that you can do with Trivy. So here are the different main commands. It's Trivy AWS for your AWS, your cloud account scanning. We are soon going to add also Azure and other cloud providers to it. Then you have config for misconfiguration scans of your resources. You have file system, which you can scan. Basically, you can scan your Go application, you can scan your Python application for vulnerabilities and security issues, also for misconfigurations. And Trivy image is used for container image scanning, and so on. So you can see the different things that you can scan by running Trivy. Now, for Trivy, let's say the skeleton for running a command is really always the same. So let's start with Git repository scanning. Let's assume you want to use somebody's repository for as like a skeleton for your own project, but you're not sure if that's a good repository that you should be using. So, oops, didn't mean to click on that. So what you can do is you can scan the Git repository before you actually even clone it locally. You can scan it for vulnerabilities and other security issues. And that's basically done by Trivy repo, and then the link to the GitHub repository. So repo is the short form for repository. Let's scan your remote Git repository. Again, you don't need to clone it, and you can scan the Git repository for security issues. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Now, you can see here, this will only happen right now. You can see here that Trivy is accessing, let me scroll back up. Where is it? It's downloading the database. And this is the database of like vulnerabilities and other issues that Trivy needs to periodically update. Now, by default, Trivy is updating the database every 6 hours. So the last time I used this was probably over 6 hours ago, and that's why Trivy had to update the database. Now, usually that's quite quick. Depending on your internet connection, it can take a little bit of time, so be patient with that. Also, the first time when you run Trivy, it will just pull updated version of the database. Now, once you've scanned, for example, your Git repository, you will find first here the file that was scanned for, in this case, for vulnerabilities, and you find here the number of vulnerabilities that it found. Now, in total, Trivy found 13 vulnerabilities in this GitHub repository, of which are 5 unknown, 1 medium, and 7 high ones. There are no critical ones, though. And here's just a table with the detail provided. Let me just zoom out so you can actually see the table and all the information that are given. So you don't have to care about the details of this table if this is too small right now. So you basically have the library that is used within this GitHub repository. Then you have the CVE, the vulnerability, that's within that library. Then the installed version in that GitHub repository. And then here is fixed version. That means if there's already a fix available for that vulnerability or not. So in this case, this vulnerability has already a fix available. And in fact, all of these vulnerabilities already have a fix available. So if you do clone, if you do use this GitHub repository, right, it's just some random GitHub repository of a Golang example application that I found online. If you do decide to use it, you can actually go ahead and fix a lot of these issues that it has within, or you can start a PR if you fancy that, right? But ultimately, it helps you to assess like how good is this, what is the state of the security of this project before I'm actually going to go and use it, right? And another thing is, Trivy also does secret scanning of most of your scan targets. So in this case, it found an exposed private key in the repository. So you might want to take care of that as well. Now, it's not going to show you the private key here. It's just masking it off, but it's ultimately exposed inside of that GitHub repository, that private key. So these are kind of the things that you would want to take care of if you do decide to use that repository. Are there any questions at this point? Anything I can answer? If not, I'm not.
No questions for now.
Okay, if there's anything unclear. Okay, awesome, amazing. Do let me know if I'm going too fast, or if I should repeat something. Like, please do post that in the chat. Okay, so after you scan the GitHub repository for security issues, you could also scan, for example, a specific branch for security issues, and then whatever is on that branch will be scanned instead of the entire, or like what's currently on the main branch. So by default, the Trivy will scan the default branch, which is usually the main or master branch, depending on how you name your branches. But you can also specify a branch. You can also specify a specific commit. So for example, if you're reviewing pull requests on any project, you could check the commit that somebody has within a pull request if they are introducing any security issues into your code base, right, before you merge it. So you could go ahead and scan that specific commit as well. Or if you want to scan a specific release of a project, you can also go ahead and do that. through the tags. So there are multiple ways in which you can go ahead and filter through the resource that you're scanning. Let's go back to the presentation. So that's all for Git repository scanning. This is how you can scan a remote Git repository before you're actually using it, which is very useful. So you actually know what you're going to use in your own projects, maybe, or what you're going to base your projects on. The next thing is file system scanning, which is also really useful for engineers. So what you can do is really clone most projects, most applications online. This is just from one of my ex-coworkers. It's just an old Ruby application. So you could go ahead and clone it and then scan it for security issues. Let me just find the command because I'm not copying from the slides. So in my case, I already cloned it. So you can find the application in here, cloned in this demo application. And now I'm going to go ahead and actually scan that application for security issues. And FS stands for file system. It's just a short form that I can also write file system. It doesn't matter for Trivy. Just a lot of people prefer just the short version. And you can go ahead and scan a file system for security issues as well. Now these are all the security issues that are in this application. So you can also scan local applications, basically anything that you have locally running.
Now I have a question.
Yeah.
Is it possible to automatically update the libraries of the cloned Git repository whenever it's cloned? In the chat, I write it.
Is it possible to? Sorry, I have to process the question. It's not you actually. Is it possible to automatically update the libraries of the cloned Git repository whenever it's cloned? That's a great question. So, sorry, I had to process it. Yeah. So, what a lot of security scanners will let you do. So, what the question is basically asking, to rephrase it in my words. And I hope I understood it correctly, the question. So a lot of security scanners, what they do is they show you, for example, I hope I didn't clear it. No, I did clear it. They show you the vulnerability list, right? And they show you that, for example, Trivy is showing you that there's a fixed version. And some security scanners that allow you to automatically create a PR where the version that you've installed is updated to the next one that has the fix. Now, that's something very handy, something very straightforward to do. Or as a user, it's very straightforward to basically just say, okay, create a PR with all the fixes. It has some downsides because some updated versions might not be compatible anymore with each other. That's one thing. Then another thing is if you just automate that process without looking at the specific libraries and don't update the libraries one by one, what could happen as well is that some of those vulnerabilities listed might not necessarily be applicable to you. So they might be in that package that you are using, but it might only be a vulnerability if you're using it in combination with another package. So let me just show you something. So if I have this list, right, I can go to this link. And this link will give me further information on the vulnerability. So each of these links will give me further information of this secure vulnerability and basically describe it further. And a lot of times you want to actually look at this additional information. I mean, most of the vulnerabilities you want to fix, but ultimately I would look at them in more detail. And then others you can obviously update also automatically if that's what the security tool provides. Now, Trivy, the open source tool, does not provide you these automated features. Most open source tools will not allow it. It's whenever you choose an enterprise project, that's when you will have it. You have this feature, you have it in Sneak. Sneak is provides security scanning as well. However, Sneak is limiting the number of times in their free version of how many scans you can perform within a specific time, I think per month. I think per month. Anyway, so the open source scanners usually don't have a way to automatically update packages. So for example, automatically update from this one to that one through a PR. You would have to do that manually with most open source tools. I hope that answers the question. If not, then please do post in the chat, and I'm happy to go into more
Okay,
detail.
and another question. This
Yes.
Trivy repo scan all branches?
Yes, it can scan specific branches, any branch, like any branch that you have, it can scan. So you just have to specify -- branch before you actually, let me go back. Oops. So you can just say Trivy repo and then -- branch and any name of your branch, and it can scan that. And then same with the tags, same with the specific commit. So you can provide also the commit hash of that commit in your Git repository and scan just that for security issues, for vulnerabilities as well. Yeah. I hope that's. You posted in the chat as well. Awesome. It's really handy to read it as well. So next big thing is, if there are no more questions, last round of questions for file system scanning and Git repository scanning. If there are not more questions, we move on to vulnerability scanning. So vulnerability scanning is, I mean, we've kind of done that already, but vulnerability scanning is usually, well, usually when people talk about vulnerability scanning, they really talk about containers vulnerability scanning most of the time. So using a container image vulnerability scanning tool is a useful way of accessing base images and also build container images. Basically, whenever you are packaging up your own container image, like your own application in a container image, that way around, you will have to choose a base image that you base your own container image on. And you want to scan, for example, those container images. When you choose one of those from, for example, the Docker Hub or another container registry, you want to scan that for vulnerabilities before you're using it. Now, generally, you should use a specific tag for all of your container images that you're using. You should never use like the latest version, but you should use one of the most up-to-date versions. Right. And in addition to that, you can always do vulnerability scanning as well of any container image that you're using. So container vulnerability scanning generally looks at two different types of information. The first thing is the open source packages that are used within a container image. So basically, what is this container image based on? A lot of them are, for example, Alpine based, or like, yeah. And the other one is the programming language used. So, for example, Trivy for container images, it looks at any packages or like the package managers and the packages used within that application to scan them for vulnerabilities. And then it assesses basically whether there are any known vulnerabilities installed in those versions that are present within that container image. Also, something else is that within container images, and I could go into more detail if you're curious and if you have more questions, there are different layers of a container image. And that's something also where different security scanners will differ, that Trivy is analyzing each different layer. And what could happen is, for example, that if a security scanner is only analyzing let's say the highest layer for vulnerabilities, that there might be vulnerabilities introduced in earlier layers of that container image, of your container image. So what Trivy does is basically analyzing any vulnerabilities that are in earlier layers, and if they are also present in the final image. Gets a bit more abstract, but I could go into more detail if people are curious. So let's do container image scanning. Now I'm using Ubuntu here in this case. You could use any other container image that you fancy. You can use one of your own container images. Let me just get my own commands up. Where is it? Just because I'm copy pasting from the repository that I showed earlier. So we can say Trivy image, and then let me just write it out. In this case, you can also just say I for image, and in Ubuntu 20.0.4. Now, as you can see, there's really it's always like Trivy, then what you want to scan, and then the resource that you're scanning. So Trivy, then the type, and then what you're going to scan. If you want to introduce any additional flags, which we're going to do in a second, you can do that before you're before the resource that you want to scan. But ultimately, with Trivy, it's always the same model, kind of. So we can go ahead and scan this container image for vulnerabilities. Now, these are just vulnerabilities. They're not going to be misconfiguration issues or similar. There's really just the vulnerabilities within that container image. And as you can see, there are 20 vulnerabilities in this container image. And a lot of these don't have a fixed version available. Now, the thing is that a lot of times we just want to see everything that we can already fix, right? Like imagine you scanning a container image and you present it sometimes with like hundreds of vulnerabilities. That's a lot of noise. That's a lot of information to deal with. So what you want to do instead is filter out as much as possible. Filter maybe by the severity. So maybe you don't care about low vulnerabilities. Maybe you're like, okay, I'm just going to care about the critical vulnerabilities. There are enough that I have to fix already. Let's just look at those. That's something you could do. And same with the fixed version. You don't need to look at any of the vulnerabilities if they don't have fix available. Like, yes, the vulnerability is there. If it's a critical vulnerability, you might want to see if you can use a different container image instead that doesn't have a critical vulnerability, like the same critical vulnerability. But ultimately, if there's no fix available, then why should you look at those vulnerabilities just yet? So what you can do is you can specify the flag ignore unfixed. Let me just do that. So ignore unfixed before the resource that you want to scan, in this case, the container image. I hope everybody can see that. And then you can go ahead and scan the container image. And as you can see, instead of 20 vulnerabilities, we just have now 2 vulnerabilities. Like these 2 vulnerabilities already have a fix available. I hope so that in the latest Ubuntu container image that these are not there anymore. But as you can see, it's already like a lot easier to look at 2 vulnerabilities instead of 20. And you can go ahead and filter out further. Now, here's another example of how you could, that you can scan not just basically specifying the container image just like that, but you can also specify any container registry. So by default, Trivy is going to use the Docker Hub. It's going to scan container images from the Docker Hub, but really any container registry will work as long as you then specify the entire registry. Yeah, so that's that. Now again, when you scan your container images first for vulnerabilities and your projects first for vulnerabilities, you might find lots and lots of vulnerabilities. Now, in this case, this is a screenshot from Twitter. Alex Jones is tweeting, just give up and die now then. They scanned, I don't know what resource, maybe some of their projects or container images or similar. They scanned them for vulnerabilities. In this case, this tool is Sneak that's used there. And they found over 550 vulnerabilities. Now, they are classified by the severity, by critical, high vulnerabilities, medium, or low. But as you can see, this is a lot. Like, it's really difficult to actually comprehend the number of vulnerabilities and then address them one by one. You wouldn't address one by one 550 vulnerabilities. Like, that would not be really scalable, would it? So what you can do, again, with Trivy is you really want to filter by the fixed version, but also you can filter just by high and critical vulnerabilities. You could do that as well. So that's what we're going to do in this Postgres container image. We're just going to go ahead and we're going to filter. No, I don't see my screen. We're going to filter by the severity of just see high and critical vulnerabilities. And usually that's enough, right? So in this case, it's showing me all the high and critical vulnerabilities. This container image is an older one. It has a lot. Like, I can keep scrolling. I'm not going to do that. But just sometimes I like to show the fun of it, of like how many vulnerabilities are in older container images actually. Even if container images have, I don't know, millions of downloads, it doesn't mean that they don't have critical security issues, right? Now, also something else, when you scan a container image, Trivy will show you if there are any exposed secrets in that container image. It won't scan for misconfigurations because misconfiguration is something that's not related to container images. That's something related to your Docker file, for example, but it will scan your container images for example, are there any keys? or any other like security tokens related in that container image, because you wouldn't want to use that necessarily. It's not the best idea to use that. So you can do exactly the same thing, specifying flags really for any scan target, whether that's a container image from the Docker Hub or from any other container registry. You can also specify the severity and other flags in that case.
Okay,
Are there
now
any
I have
questions?
questions. Yes, I have one.
Awesome. Okay, before we move on to the next part. Awesome.
Okay.
Questions?
Trivy can find out customizing libraries, develop it, and install it on the system, or the system's calls performed using those libraries.
Yes, it can. Can find customized libraries developed and installed on the system. Yes, it can. So also, for example, if you develop a Go library, and you use it within another project, it will be able to find vulnerabilities within any of those sub-dependencies, like third-party dependencies as well, that you might be using in your projects, or system calls performed using those libraries. I don't know exactly what you mean by the second part, but yes, it like whenever there is a library used in any part of your resource that you're scanning, it can find those. Like it can, if it's directly used, or if you also, if let's say I have a project and that project is dependent on a library, and that library is using something else, any other resource, then Trivy will also find vulnerabilities in that other resource, even if I'm not directly using that other resource. I hope that makes sense. And I hope that answers your question. Otherwise, if you have more, detailed questions, feel also free to drop into, either tweet at me on Twitter and I can get you the right answers, or you can also join the Aqua Slack channel and ask there, because all the maintainers are on Twitter and also on Slack, and they can help you, and I can help you then better if I can't answer your questions right now. And other questions regarding vulnerability scanning?
No more questions for now.
Awesome. Those are great questions. Thank you so much. It's really excited to get questions, especially like during live presentations, live workshops. Awesome. Cool. So you can, if you check for, whoops. Let's clear this up. Trivy image
Wait,
dash.
There's a question now.
Okay. That's cool.
Okay. Do you recommend to add Trivy to our CID pipelines when building Docker mesh?
I will answer that question throughout the next parts of the presentation, and I will put extra focus on answering that question. But hang tight, because it will make more sense if I answer the question later on than if I answer it right now. But great question. Now, until I get to that question, I just want to show you that with any resource that you want to scan with Trivy, I basically wrote Trivy image and then --help. You can find all of the different flags. So I just showed you 2 of the flags, but you can really filter out by lots of different types of flags, and you can also scan for misconfiguration issues and lots more. So these are just like, I just showed you these 2 flags, but you can also do a lot more with the commands, with the Trivy commands. So here you can see a full list of the different flags. Now the documentation also provides more detailed examples on how to use those different flags. Just mentioning it before we move on to the next part. And where I'm also going to answer the question. So the next part is misconfiguration scanning. Now, misconfiguration is basically whenever you define, you configure a resource, whether that's your container image, your Docker file, whether that's your Terraform, your CloudFormation, your Kubernetes manifests, whenever you define any of those resources, whenever you configure them, you might introduce misconfigurations. And misconfiguration is basically any time that you say it should look like you configure it in a way that isn't how best practices would define it. Now, best practices are defined by people across the space, by security researchers, and they define those best practices for how you should configure your different resources. And basically, a misconfiguration, when you scan for misconfigurations, then whatever you define is compared to those best practices. And if it doesn't match, then it's telling you have a misconfiguration issue. Now, usually you would then want to fix it. Oops. Yeah, that's the right one, but I have forgotten to change the title. Sorry about it. So this is not file system scanning, this is misconfiguration scanning. So I have here in this repository, in my example repository, I have a folder called that infrastructure as code. And within it, I have Docker, I have a Docker folder, I have a Kubernetes folder, and I have a Terraform folder. So in that Docker folder, for example, I have just this container image defined on how it's supposed to run. And within Kubernetes, I have a Kubernetes manifest. Now, this is obviously an example. This is just called that manifest with all of the things that you shouldn't do. Same with this Terraform file, things that you shouldn't do. That's what's done in these infrastructure as code configuration files, right? So what you can do, let me just make this bigger so people can actually see it if you're on a small screen. So with Trivy config or configuration, you could then scan either all of these resources within that folder. That's something you could do, or you could scan, for example, just whatever is in the Docker folder for misconfiguration issues. So now it tells you something that you learn quite from the start. When you're using container images, you shouldn't use the latest tag. So that's one misconfiguration issue. Another thing is you shouldn't expose port 22. So it's telling you all of those different configuration issues. And again, you can see additional details on why it's a misconfiguration, why it's a configuration issue, security issue, through this link. So if you're unsure about something, then you can check out the additional link and see more information on why it's a configuration issue. So similarly to how we just scanned the Docker repository, we can also scan the Terraform for example, for misconfiguration issues. And it will tell me things that I did wrong in the Terraform file. For example, again, port 80 is not something that you should expose. Now, there are other issues, and you can go one by one through them and fix them, right? So this is actually something using a security scanner for my Kubernetes manifest actually helped me to write better Kubernetes YAML manifests, because it taught me a lot about how Kubernetes YAML files, Kubernetes resources should be written in a more secure way. So you could also, when you're getting started with Kubernetes, just to mention it, security scanners that tell you about misconfiguration issues in this YAML manifest are really, really helpful for you to learn about how you should or should not write those. Are there any pipelines? So let's answer the pipeline question. So you can generally use Trivy, and let's go to the installation. So you can use Trivy in all of your different CI/CD pipelines. So these are the different pipeline steps that we have available by default. So we, for example, have GitHub Actions. Now this is the official one by us, by Aqua Security, and this is the GitHub action, and you can integrate it into your CI/CD pipeline. Now the benefit of this is that you can have more automated, more continuous scanning of your container images, whether the container images that you're using before you use them as base images and similar, or to scan also your Docker file before you're building the container image, and then also to scan your final resources, your final container image, and your final infrastructure as code manifest and similar before you actually go ahead and deploy them. So that's why CI/CD pipelines are very, very useful. So generally what I would do is first scan resources locally, but then once you scan resources locally, that's when you want to then, as a next step on a continuous basis, scan those resources also in your CI/CD pipelines. So yes, Trivy can be used in your CI/CD pipeline and should be used. You should use a security scan in your CI/CD pipeline. It's very straightforward to do with integrating those different CI/CD steps, pipeline steps. Let's go back to the documentation. Let me just go back here. So you can really use in Trivy in any CI/CD pipeline. These are just the official ones, but as long as you can install a tool in your CI/CD pipeline, which most allow, then you can also use Trivy there. Now, the thing is, if you have more automated way for checking for example, critical vulnerabilities, you could make sure that the pipeline fails when there are critical vulnerabilities or critical misconfigurations in your infrastructure as code found. So I hope this answers the question.
And I have another question.
Awesome.
It's
Love how many questions there are.
Does the further ID offer a similar tool set to Trivy?
I haven't used it, so I don't know. You could post this question, or I can post this question later. Let me take a screenshot in the Aqua Slack channel, and then I'm sure that people within the contributors, maintainers know an answer to that. I haven't used the IDE. What happens a lot, people ask me, for example, and it's a bit different, but people ask me how the security scanners of a cloud provider will differ from specific security scanners such as Trivy. So what happens that a lot of cloud provider, whether that's Google Cloud, whether that's Azure or AWS, they all offer their own kind of security scanners. Now, some of them integrate also, for example, GitLab is using Trivy under the hood for their security scanning for at least some components. But basically, lots of these cloud providers, for example, they offer security scanning. But the thing is, because they're not focused on security scanning, the results might be slightly outdated or might not be as applicable to your resources as they could be. So as you're using Trivy, it provides a very comprehensive or more comprehensive information than most of these out-of-the-box scanners that you get as part of other tools. That's just something that I want to say, just generally speaking, not pointing out at any specific security scanner out there, but that's just one of the comparisons between Trivy and more specific ones. Or like some that basically come out of the box of those cloud providers. Also, the thing is, for example, Trivy is some of the core maintainers are employed at Aqua, and Aqua is having their own research team in-house, and it's really focused on security, right? On cloud native security and identifying issues, whether that's new attacks or new attack types or new vulnerabilities and similar. And then those are basically getting integrated into our security scanning as well. So you might get more accurate, more detailed information. Also with all of the links that you can see to each, for example, each vulnerability. I hope that answers the question. Okay, so if there, you can always ask more questions. Also, you can tweet at me on, there's not my Twitter link on this one. You can always tweet at me with questions or message me on Twitter as well about questions, or reach out on the Slack channel, on the Aqua Slack channel. No, the next big thing is, if there are no other questions right now on the other parts, the Trivy Kubernetes operator. So again, if you have, this will be something that you might be kind of processes that you might be familiar with. If you've already used Kubernetes operators, if you've never used Kubernetes before, then this might be a really kind of irritating part of the workshop, let's say. But there are other presentations where I give more of an introduction to getting started with the Trivy Kubernetes operator and Kubernetes operators as well. I also have some tutorials on that on my YouTube channel if you're curious and you would like to get started. But ultimately, if you have a Kubernetes cluster, you can divide it into different namespaces. Namespaces are just like logical divisions within your Kubernetes cluster. Oh, this part is used for that, this part is used for that, this part is used for that. They are all distributed across your Kubernetes, your nodes, but namespaces basically allow you to divide your cluster into logical separators. And so in this case, this graphic just divides it into an application namespace with your services running, maybe there's one app running, then your monitoring namespace, where you have, for example, your monitoring tools running, and then you have a security namespace. In the case of Trivy, you will have a Trivy system namespace where you spin up the operator. Now, the operator is basically Trivy plus more. So I'm saying Trivy plus more is because Trivy by itself, we use Trivy in our terminal, right? This is not our Kubernetes cluster. This is not infrastructure. This is not an automated way of checking our running workloads. Now you can do with Trivy Kates, you can check also, you can check your Kubernetes cluster, your running workloads through the terminal, but it won't happen on a continuous basis. That's what the operator is for. So the operator is basically packaging up Trivy in a way that you can easily install it inside of your Kubernetes cluster. Here's the GitHub repository. Again, we would highly appreciate if you like our project, if you can give us a star. But here's the repository, and you can find the documentation here again. It's similarly structured. So you have here in the getting started section, you have the different installation options. Now, if you've already used Kubernetes, you likely are familiar with how you can install resources in your cluster, such as kubectl through kubectl apply. Now, kubectl is the CLI tool that allows you to access your cluster, and then you can just apply resources to it, such as deploying the Trivy operator. Now, addition to that, a lot of projects provide Helm installations. So Helm is basically a package manager like npm for Kubernetes manifests. So you can install also the Trivy operator through a Helm chart in a more compact way, and the Helm chart also allows you to really configure the Trivy operator in ways that you deem useful. And that's going back to the earlier question about whether or not Trivy and other open source security scanners can be used for production environments and production use cases. Yes, totally. In that case, you would probably want to use, if you're installing it in your cluster, you would want to use Helm to really configure it inside of your cluster instead of kubectl, because that way you can define values file with, for example, set Trivy, the ignore unfixed, what I mentioned earlier in the CLI, to true. So it's only showing you fixed vulnerabilities that already have a fix available. So this is how you could install Trivy operator inside of your cluster. Now, I'm not going to do that right now because sometimes it's going to take some time. I already did that. I have here my Kubernetes cluster. It's a DigitalOcean Kubernetes cluster, just a 3-node cluster. So here are my nodes that encompass the cluster. As you can see, I let my cluster running for quite some time. And in there, I have different namespaces, what I just mentioned earlier, that kind of divide the cluster. So I have like my monitoring namespace, my Trivy system namespace, my application namespace, and I also have a demo namespace. And within the Trivy system namespace, Trivy system, I have here my pod running that runs the operator. So it's basically the container that is the Trivy operator is running here inside of my cluster, inside of a pod. And then I also have a service that allows me to just basically access metrics from any reports that Trivy operator produces. Now, what are the reports that the Trivy operator produces? The Trivy operator has different, it is installing lots of custom resources. So here are all of the custom resource definitions, which are basically custom Kubernetes resources that it's installing. If you're new to Kubernetes, the power of Kubernetes is really about the Kubernetes API. So what you can do is expand the Kubernetes, like any functionality of any cluster, through custom resources. So you can define your custom resources. So for in this case, for our vulnerability scanning, we define vulnerability report. And so we have here our own API that is expanding the Kubernetes API. And here is the type vulnerability report within that API. And here's the resource. That's a custom resource. And that allows us to scan container images that are running within your cluster for vulnerabilities. And they are basically provided through this vulnerability report. So when you install the operator, it's installing lots of these custom resource definitions. And the thing is, so once you have it installed, I'm going to open up my cluster now, and through a tool called K9S, because that allows you to really nicely open your cluster. So going to my namespaces, these are my namespaces here. And I have here my demo namespace. And in the demo namespace, I have a React application running. So just 2 pods for my React application running. And then within my Trivy system namespace, I have the Trivy operator running. And what happens basically, whenever you have a new pod running, a new pod that's spun up, in this case, for example, the Trivy operator will launch a vulnerability scan of that application, of that container image, and will save that in a vulnerability report. Let me try that again. Vulnerability report. So this is the vulnerability report for that for the container image. So I can go to describe, or like actually to YAML. I can see the YAML manifest. So this is the vulnerability report. Here it's the same API that I just showed you. And it's telling me all of the vulnerabilities that it found within that container image for this, for my React application. So here's the repository. Here's my container image, my from the container registry. Here's the tag that's used. And then in addition to this vulnerability report will basically show me here the summary of like 3 critical vulnerabilities, 3 high vulnerabilities, 8 medium, 2 low, and 2 unknown. Those are all in that React application. Now, this is obviously great to have this report. We have other reports. We have, for example, config audit reports, audit report. So these are my configuration issues. So I have 1 medium misconfiguration and 8 low ones. And then I also have exposed secret scans. So this shows me, is there in this application, are there any exposed secrets? No, there are no exposed secrets. And then I also have, lastly, I have RBAC scans. No, that's not what I want to do. RBAC, how are they called? RBAC assessment report. Long word. RBAC assessment report. Now, in this case, it didn't perform a scan, probably because it doesn't have the right resources for that application to scan. But ultimately, you have all those different scans that are going to be performed on your application. Now, the thing is, as you can see there within your cluster, and this is not really like the YAML manifest is not really a nice way to look at it. So what you would want to do is, once you have set it up, once you have those scans performing, you would want to connect the Trivy operator through another tool, such as, for example, to your observability stack, to Prometheus, to access the reports, access the metrics. Here's again like how controllers, how operators work, but I didn't go into detail. So again, an operator, a Kubernetes operator, just performs a continuous task. So for example, the Trivy operator will scan all of the resources within your cluster and see if there are any new resources that have to be scanned for those different scans, and then perform those scans. So that's what an operator does. It has a task, or like it scans your resources and then has a task to perform based on certain triggers. So here's the installation. That's everything I went through. Yeah. Are there any questions related to in-cluster scanning? Awesome.
No, for now.
Awesome. So moving on to our last part. Ultimately, the Trivy operator, there are lots of different tutorials that are out there online on our YouTube channel and on my YouTube channel. The links are provided at the end, and how you can connect them with, for example, Prometheus, the Trivy operator, and similar, and different use cases, what you can do with it. So do check this out if you want to learn more about the Trivy operator. There are also tutorials on the documentation. Now, the last part I want to show, which has been big for supply chain security, especially earlier the year, are SBOM generation and scanning. So SBOM stands for Software Bill of Materials. And it's basically an inventory list of anything that's within a resource. For example, in your container images, you will use different packages, right? So you might want to list to somebody different packages and the versions of those packages and so on that are used. And that's what an SBOM ultimately is. It's just an inventory list of everything that's within an application, within a container image, within any packages. So Trivy also allows you to generate an SBOM. And you can generate an SBOM in different formats. The two main formats are SPDX and CycloneDX. Now, in this example, I'm using the SPDX format. Let me just open that up. Here. So I'm basically generating for this container image, for the basically my container registry. For this container image, I'm creating SBOM in the SPDX format, and I'm saving it as an output in this file sbom.spdx. You can also save it in a JSON file and in multiple other different files, like different types. So you can change the format basically, and or like the output as well, in which the SBOM comes. But in this case, I'm using SPDX, and I can go ahead and generate that, and then I can output the SBOM.spdx. And as you can see, this is my inventory list. Now, the SPDX format is generally quite readable. But yeah, so this is generally used as like a machine readable version. Like, people are not really supposed to read SBOMs in that way. You would use the SBOM for additional use cases and purposes, and also to share the inventory, or like to keep track of what versions are used within your resources over time and things like that. Oops. I don't see my terminal there. It's like hiding. Yeah, you could also then scan the SBOM for vulnerabilities as well. So the SBOM has basically the list of all the packages that are used. So you could scan those next for vulnerabilities as well. So this is everything that Trivy does. I showed you most of it as like this, let's say, the starter version. You can make those different scans more complex. And something I didn't show you is AWS scanning, just because I don't use AWS a lot, and I leave it up to you to try it out if you're using AWS. Otherwise, I highly encourage you to try out Trivy, to let us know what you like, what you don't like. Maybe let us know some of the features that you would like to see. Yeah, some additional tips when you get started with security scanning as the last part of this workshop, of this presentation, is first of all, assign ownership. Really assign ownership also of different types of vulnerabilities, of different resources. So for example, somebody is taking ownership of the vulnerabilities within your container images, somebody else is taking ownership of the vulnerabilities within your infrastructure as code, Terraform. Really make it somebody's job to look at it and empower people, give them a clear guidance on how they are supposed to find and mitigate any security issues. Don't introduce too many new tools at once. That's something that a lot of people do. They want to get started with everything at once, with all of those different features all at once, and that can be quite overwhelming. Really get started just with one type of scanning. It will be enough. You don't have to do everything at the same time. And then really utilize existing workflows, platforms, and processes. The more you can use the dashboards and platforms that you're already using, the better it is for your end users, for your engineering team, for example, because ultimately, if I'm already using dashboards in Grafana, if I'm already using Prometheus to look at how reliable my application, my services are, I can also then look at the security reports through those existing dashboards. So here are the additional resources. I hope you have access to I can send the presentation over at the end, and also share all of those resources on the Slack. So again, the Slack is slack.aquasec.com. You can see it here. Should have written it out. But yeah, so do join us there if you have any questions. Also, if you have any questions, any resources that you would like to see, please do tweet at me. I'm most active on Twitter. Yeah, are there any other questions?
No more questions for now.
Amazing. Thank you so much for having me. This was really great.
Thank you. Well,
Awesome.
gracias a todos y a todas por haber participado. Espero que hayan disfrutado este workshop. Queda mucho más de Nerdearla 2022. Sigan en alguna charla o los workshops, chequen la agenda full. Y thank you very much for being part of Nerdearla 2022.
Thank you. Thank you. It was great. Have a great day. Bye-bye.